King George V ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface, yet in his final moments he held less authority than the physician at his bedside. On the night of January 20th, 1936, the king's fate was not left to God, but seized by the cold pragmatism of Lord Dawson. Obsessed with dignity, Dawson decided that a royal death was too important to be left to chance or to the vulgarity of evening tabloids. To ensure the news broke in the prestigious morning columns of the Times, he administered a lethal injection, ending the monarch's life to suit a publication timetable. It was not a natural passing, but the most meticulously orchestrated execution of the 20th century. To understand why a doctor would dare to euthanize a king for the sake of a newspaper headline, you have to understand the fragile world George V inhabited. When George was born in 1865, the British monarchy appeared to be made of granite. Queen Victoria was on the throne, a seemingly immortal figure draped in black silk. The British Empire was expanding at a rate that defied logic, painting the map pink from Canada to India, from Australia to Africa. It was a world of absolute certainties. Kings ruled, subjects obeyed, and the sun never set on British dominance. Europe was a family business. The monarchs of the continent were not just political allies or enemies. They were cousins. They called each other by nicknames like Willie, Nicky, and Georgie. They spent their summers on yachts in Cowes and their winters in palaces in St. Petersburg and Berlin. They wrote letters to one another in bad English and worse French, gossiping about weddings and uniforms while their armies prepared for war. It looked permanent, it looked unshakable, but it was a house of cards. George V was part of a generation of royals who would see this world disintegrate. He would watch as the Romanovs in Russia were lined up against a cellar wall and shot. He would watch as the Hohenzollerns in Germany were forced into exile. He would watch as the Habsburgs in Austria were dismantled. By the time his reign ended, the trade union of kings was bankrupt. George was the survivor. He was the one man who realized, earlier than anyone else, that the old rules no longer applied. He understood that a king in the 20th century could not rely on the divine right of kings. The people no longer believed that God had appointed the monarch. If the monarchy was to survive, it had to justify its existence every single day. It had to be useful. It had to be respectable. This fear, the fear of revolution, the fear of irrelevance, drove every decision George V ever made. It turned him into a man obsessed with duty, punctuality, and image. He wasn't an intellectual. He was a pragmatist. He was the CEO of a failing company who realizes that to save the business, he has to fire his own relatives and rebrand the product. But before he was the ruthless savior of the dynasty, he was something far simpler. He was the spare. History is full of second sons who were never meant to wear the crown. Henry VIII was a second son, Charles I was a second son, and George Frederick Ernest Albert was the quintessential second son. Born on June 3, 1865 at Marlborough House in London, George was the second child of the Prince and Princess of Wales. From the moment he took his first breath, he was defined by who he was not. He was not the heir. That position belonged to his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, known to the family as Eddie. Eddie was the golden boy of the future. He was the one destined to be king. He was the one who received the attention, the expectations, and the pressure. George was simply Georgie. He was the backup plan. In the brutal calculus of royal succession, the spare is necessary insurance, but they are not the focus. This lack of focus turned out to be the greatest blessing of George's early life. While Eddie was being groomed for statecraft, George was allowed a freedom that most royals could only dream of. His father, Edward VII, had a surprisingly modern idea for his sons. He believed they should see the world not from the window of a palace, but from the deck of a ship. "The Navy will make men of them," Edward declared. At the age of 12, George was packed off to the naval training ship, HMS Britannia. It was not a luxury cruise. The conditions were Spartan, the discipline was harsh, the food was terrible. For a prince of the blood, it was a shock to the system. There were no servants to dress him. There were no courtiers to flatter him. He was a cadet, nothing more. If he stepped out of line, he was punished. If he failed a task, he was reprimanded. For the first time in his life, George was judged not by his title but by his performance. And he loved it. He thrived in the Navy. The structured life, the clear hierarchy, the camaraderie of the mess hall, it suited his personality perfectly. George was not a complex thinker. He did not enjoy abstract philosophy or the nuances of art. He liked clear orders. He liked knowing exactly what was expected of him and exactly when it was expected. The Navy gave him a code of conduct that he would adhere to for the rest of his life: duty, punctuality, order. For 15 years, George lived the life of a professional naval officer. He traveled the world visiting the far-flung outposts of the empire he would one day rule, though he didn't know it yet. He got a tattoo of a dragon on his arm in Japan. He kept a parrot. He swore like a sailor. He developed a booming quarterdeck voice that could cut through a gale or a dinner party. He was happy. He was essentially a Victorian naval captain, conservative, bluff, slightly narrow-minded, but deeply honorable. He had no ambition to be anything else. He assumed he would spend his life in the Royal Navy, rising through the ranks, eventually retiring to a country estate to shoot pheasants and collect stamps. He was entirely unprepared for the storm that was coming. But to understand George, one must look at the brother who completely overshadowed him, Prince Eddie. History has not been kind to Prince Albert Victor. He is often portrayed as slow-witted, lethargic, and dissipated. Rumors swirled around him like smoke. There were whispers of involvement in the Cleveland Street scandal, a homosexual brothel raid that rocked Victorian London. There were even darker, completely unsubstantiated conspiracy theories that would later link him to the Jack the Ripper murders. Eddie was a problem for the royal family. He seemed incapable of learning. His tutors despaired of him. He drifted through life with a vague, amiable detachment. Queen Victoria, always sharp-eyed, worried about the future of the throne in his hands. George, by contrast, was seen as the steady one, the reliable one. The brothers were inseparable despite their differences. They wrote to each other constantly. George adored Eddie. He never showed a flicker of jealousy over his brother's superior status. He was content to walk 2 steps behind. By 1891, the Eddie problem needed a solution. The royal family decided that marriage was the answer. If they could find a strong, sensible, intelligent wife for Eddie, perhaps she could prop him up. She could be the spine he seemed to lack. They found the perfect candidate, Princess Victoria, Mary of Teck. Mary was a minor German princess raised in Britain. She was not wealthy, her family was constantly in debt. But she was formidable. She was intelligent, incredibly well-read, and possessed a spine of steel. She was the granddaughter of George III, giving her the royal blood, but she had lived on the fringes of the court, giving her a hunger for stability. Queen Victoria approved. The engagement was announced in late 1891. The future seemed set. Eddie would be king, Mary would be queen, and George would be the loyal admiral brother, supporting them from the sidelines. The wedding was scheduled for February 27, 1892. It would never happen. In January 1892, a severe influenza pandemic was sweeping across Europe. It was known as the Russian flu. It was vicious, fast-acting, and deadly. At Sandringham House, the same house where George would face his own death 44 years later, Prince Eddie fell ill. At first it seemed like a bad cold. Then it developed into pneumonia. The atmosphere in the house turned from festive wedding preparations to a terrified vigil. George watched as his brother, the man who was supposed to rule the empire, fought for breath. The delirium set in. The strength faded. On January 14th, 1892, just weeks before his wedding, Prince Albert Victor died. He was 28 years old. The shock was seismic. The line of succession had been severed. In a single heartbeat, the weight of the British Empire shifted from the dead brother to the living one. George was devastated. "No two brothers could have loved each other more than we did," he wrote in his diary. "Alas, it is too sad." He was 26 years old. He had lost his best friend in his career in the same moment. He had to leave the Navy. He had to say goodbye to the freedom of the seas. He had to step into the glare of the public eye. He was now the Duke of York. He was the heir to the heir. But there was another complication. The royal family had invested heavily in Princess Mary of Teck. They had chosen her specifically because she had the qualities of a future queen. She was too valuable to lose just because the groom had died. Queen Victoria, in her infinite pragmatism, looked at the situation and saw a solution that today feels almost medieval in its cold logic. If Mary was good enough for Eddie, she was good enough for George. The pressure began to mount. The family subtly, and then not so subtly, pushed George and Mary together. It was an incredibly awkward situation. They were united by grief for the same man, one his brother, one his fiancée. They spent time walking in the gardens at Sandringham, mourning Eddie, while the family watched from the windows, waiting for nature or duty to take its course. George was terrified. He was shy with women. He had been in love before with the daughter of an admiral, but had been forbidden to marry her because she was a commoner. Now he was being told to court his dead brother's bride. But George was a sailor. He followed orders. He understood duty. On May 3, 1893, just over a year after Eddie's death, George proposed to Mary in the garden of the house at Sheen. It wasn't a romance of passion. It was a merger. It was two people accepting a job description. Mary accepted. What happened next is one of the most surprising twists in royal history. This arranged marriage, built on a grave and a political calculation, became one of the most successful partnerships the monarchy has ever seen. They didn't just tolerate each other. They came to rely on each other completely. George, the rough sailor who hated public speaking and feared the intellect, found in Mary a partner who was calm, intellectual, and unfailingly supportive. She polished his rough edges. He gave her the security she had craved all her life. They wrote to each other every day when they were apart. Years later, George would write to her, "I love you more and more every year." It was a marriage of iron, and they would need it. Because the century was turning and the world was about to catch fire. The years between his marriage in 1893 and his accession in 1910 were George's training ground. He lived as the Duke of York and later the Prince of Wales, but he refused to act like a typical royal. He hated the smart set that his father, Edward VII, surrounded himself with. Edward was a hedonist, a lover of rich food, beautiful mistresses, and high-stakes gambling. George was a Victorian throwback. He preferred a quiet dinner at home with Mary. He preferred stamp collecting to horse racing. He preferred shooting birds at Sandringham to balls in London. He was frankly boring, and he was proud of it. But this boredom was a shield. George looked at the changing society, the rise of socialism, the suffragettes demanding votes for women, the labor unions striking for better wages, and he recoiled. He didn't understand it. He wanted the world to stay exactly as it was in the Navy, ordered, hierarchical, and predictable. In 1901, the great Queen Victoria died. The 19th century was officially over. George's father became King Edward VII. Edward VII's reign was the brief, glittering Indian summer of the British monarchy. It was the Edwardian era, a time of opulence, garden parties, and massive hats. But beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of Europe were grinding together. Germany, led by George's bombastic cousin Kaiser Wilhelm II, was building a massive navy to challenge Britain. Alliances were locking into place. The countdown to Armageddon had begun. George watched his father navigate this world with charm and diplomacy. Edward VII was known as the peacemaker. He used his personal relationships with European royals to smooth over tensions. He was a master of the soft power of kingship. George was not. He was gruff. He had strong prejudices. He hated foreigners. He famously said, "Abroad is awful. I know, I've been." He was terrified that he would not be able to fill his father's shoes. In May 1910, the test came. Edward VII, a heavy smoker and eater, died of bronchitis and heart failure. George was 44 years old. He stood by his father's deathbed, devastated. He wrote in his diary, "I have lost my best friend and the best of fathers. I am heartbroken and overwhelmed with grief, but God will help me in my responsibilities, and darling May will be my comfort, as she has always been." He was now King George V. He inherited a nation on the brink of constitutional crisis. The House of Lords and the House of Commons were at war over the budget. The Irish were on the verge of civil war over home rule. The suffragettes were burning mailboxes and smashing windows. And across the North Sea, the German Kaiser was testing his battleships. The Sailor King had taken the helm just as the barometer began to plummet. Most politicians in London looked at the new king, this simple stamp-collecting naval officer with little education and no intellectual curiosity, and despaired. They thought he was too weak, too stupid, and too inexperienced to handle the crisis. They were wrong. They mistook simplicity for stupidity. They mistook silence for weakness. George V was about to prove that in a world of complex, fiery ideologies, a simple sense of duty was the most dangerous weapon of all. But first, he would have to survive the war that would kill his cousins, destroy his world, and force him to make the most ruthless decision of his life. When George V ascended the throne in 1910, he was not just the king of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India. He was a member of the most exclusive and incestuous club on earth, the monarchs of Europe. To look at a family portrait of European royalty in 1913 is to see a hall of mirrors. They all looked alike. King George V, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were first cousins. George and Nicholas in particular looked so similar that at weddings and funerals, relatives often confused them. They shared the same hooded eyes, the same trimmed beards, and the same quiet, anxious demeanor. They wrote to each other constantly. George called the German emperor Willie. He called the Russian Tsar Nicky. They were family. They believed that their blood ties were a safety net that would prevent the world from falling into chaos. After all, how could nations go to war when their rulers were swapping birthday gifts and holiday photos? They were wrong. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 shattered the illusion of the trade union of kings. It wasn't just a geopolitical catastrophe. For George, it was a fratricidal nightmare. The man leading the enemy forces, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria. The bombs falling on London were, in a strange and twisted way, being sent by family. George V found himself in an impossible position. He was a British king with a German name, a German wife, and a German lineage. As the casualty lists began to mount, thousands of British boys dying in the mud of Flanders, the public mood in Britain turned ugly. They began to look at the palace with suspicion. They began to ask, whose side is he really on? This is the story of how George V proved his loyalty. It is the story of how he stripped away his own identity, severed his own blood ties, and made the coldest calculation of his life to save his throne. He would survive the war, but his cousins and his conscience would not. The war did not start well for George personally. He was desperate to do his duty, but he felt helpless. While Willie in Germany was strutting around in military uniforms directing generals, George was a constitutional monarch. He had no real power to direct the war. He could only advise, encourage, and warn. He channeled his energy into visibility. He visited the troops in France repeatedly. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to share the hardship. On one of these visits in 1915, tragedy struck. The king was inspecting troops near the front line when his horse, terrified by the cheering crowds and the noise of the war, reared up and threw him. The king landed hard. His pelvis was fractured. He was crushed under the weight of the animal. He was evacuated in agony, broken and bruised. For the rest of his life, he would suffer from chronic pain as a result of this accident. It was the moment the physical decline began, the decline that would eventually lead to the morphine syringe in 1936. But in 1915, he refused to show weakness. He was back at his desk as soon as he could sit up. But physical pain was nothing compared to the political pain that was coming. By 1916, the war had become a meat grinder. The Battle of the Somme saw 60,000 British casualties on the very first day. The grief in Britain was overwhelming, and grief quickly turned to anger. The public needed someone to blame, and they couldn't reach the Kaiser. So they turned their eyes to the German living in Buckingham Palace. Rumors began to circulate, malicious, hysterical rumors. People whispered that Queen Mary was hoarding food while the people starved. They whispered that the king was secretly communicating with the Kaiser. They whispered that there was a German spy ring operating out of the palace. It sounds ridiculous today, but in 1917, it was dangerous. The Russian Revolution had just exploded. The Tsar, George's look-alike cousin, had been forced to abdicate. The message was clear. Monarchies are not immortal. If the people get angry enough, they will tear you down. The breaking point came from a surprising source, the writer H.G. Wells. Wells wrote a scathing article about the war effort in which he attacked the British leadership, but he saved his sharpest venom for the royal family. He referred to George's court as an alien and uninspiring court. The word alien hit George like a bullet. He was furious. "I may be uninspiring," he reportedly shouted to a courtier, "but I'll be damned if I'm an alien." But he knew Wells was right. To the British people, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha sounded like the enemy. The name of the royal house was a liability. It was German. It had to go. In 1917, George V initiated the greatest rebranding exercise in corporate history. He summoned his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, and gave him a mission. Find us a new name. It had to be English. It had to be rooted in history. It had to be solid. They brainstormed. Tudor Stuart was suggested. Plantagenet. England. Then Stamfordham suggested Windsor. It was perfect. Windsor Castle was the oldest inhabited castle in the world. It was a symbol of British strength and continuity. It smelled of English oak and stone. It had no German connection whatsoever. On July 17, 1917, King George V issued a royal proclamation. It was a legal document that erased his past. We, of our royal will and authority, do hereby declare and announce that, as from the date of this, our royal proclamation, our house and family shall be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. He didn't stop there. He ordered all his British relatives to strip themselves of their German titles. The Battenbergs became the Mountbattens. The Duke of Teck became the Marquess of Cambridge. It was a total purge. George V was effectively telling the world, "We are not German, we are British, we are one of you." When the Kaiser heard the news in Berlin, he reportedly joked, "I look forward to seeing the play The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha." But the joke was on him. George had saved the brand. He had immunized the British monarchy against the anti-German virus. But saving the name was the easy part. The hard part was what to do with the relatives who couldn't change their names, specifically the Romanovs. This is the darkest chapter in George V's life. It is the moment where the dull king showed a capacity for ruthlessness that chills the blood. In early 1917, the Russian Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. He, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were placed under house arrest by the provisional government. They were vulnerable, but they were alive. The British government, led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, initially offered asylum. An invitation was sent. The plan was to evacuate the Romanovs via the port of Murmansk and bring them to England. It was the honorable thing to do. Nicholas was George's cousin, his friend, and a loyal ally in the war. But George V hesitated. He began to receive reports from his private secretary. The British public was not sympathetic to the Tsar. To the British working class, Nicholas was Nicholas the Bloody. He was a tyrant who had oppressed his people. The labor movement in Britain was growing stronger, and many of them supported the Russian Revolution. George panicked. He looked at his own shaky throne. He looked at the angry crowds in London. He realized that if he brought the Tsar to England, he would be inviting the revolution into his own living room. People would see him protecting a despot. It might be the spark that burned down Buckingham Palace. So, George V did the unthinkable. He intervened. Documents released decades later reveal the truth. It was not the politicians who blocked the rescue. It was the king. Lord Stamfordham sent a message to the Foreign Office stating that the king thought the presence of the imperial family in Britain would be embarrassing and that the invitation should be withdrawn. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, was surprised, but he wasn't going to argue. If the king wanted to wash his hands of his cousin, the government wouldn't stand in his way. The offer of asylum was rescinded. The door was slammed shut. Nicholas and Alexandra sat in their palace in Russia, packing their bags, waiting for the British ship that would never come. They were eventually moved to Siberia, then to Yekaterinburg. On the night of July 16, 1918, in the basement of the Apachev house, the entire family was woken up and told to dress. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and their 6th son, Alexei, were lined up against a wall. Bolshevik gunmen opened fire. It was a brutal, messy execution. The children had diamonds sewn into their corsets, which deflected the bullets, prolonging the slaughter. They were bayoneted to death. When the news reached London, George V was grief-stricken. He attended a memorial service. He wrote in his diary, "It was a foul murder. I was devoted to Nicky, who was the kindest of men and thorough gentleman, loved his country and people." But the grief was tinged with a terrible secret. George knew deep down that he had signed their death warrant. He had prioritized the survival of the House of Windsor over the lives of the House of Romanov. He had chosen his job over his family. It was a decision that would haunt him. But it worked. The revolution never came to Britain. The monarchy survived. The price was 7 bodies in a mine shaft in Russia. By November 19, 18, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed. The world emerged from the trenches, blinking in the sunlight, utterly changed. George V looked out at the landscape of Europe. It was a graveyard of empires. The Romanovs were dead. The Hohenzollerns were in exile. The Habsburgs were deposed. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing. Of all the great imperial powers that had started the war, only one monarch was still standing on his balcony, waving to cheering crowds: King George V. He had won. He had navigated the storm. He had successfully rebranded his dynasty. He had proven that a constitutional monarchy could survive a total war. But the man standing on that balcony was not the same man who had ascended the throne in 1910. He was harder now. He was physically broken by his accident in France. He was mentally scarred by the betrayal of his cousins. He had learned the ultimate lesson of modern kingship: popularity is the only shield. To keep the crown, you must be the people's king. He had secured the throne, but now he had to secure the succession. And that meant turning his attention to his own children. If George V was a ruthless political operator, he was a disastrous father. He had applied the same rigid discipline to his sons that he applied to his navy, and the results were beginning to show. His eldest son, David, was the hero of the war generation, handsome, charming, modern. But George saw something else in him. He saw weakness. He saw selfishness. George V had saved the monarchy from the Germans and the Bolsheviks. But as the 1920s roared into view, he began to realize that the greatest threat to the House of Windsor wasn't a foreign army. It was his own son. The war was over. The battle for the soul of the Windsor dynasty was just beginning. Christmas 1918, Sandringham House. The royal family gathered for the holidays. It was the first peaceful Christmas in 4 years. The tables were set. The gifts were exchanged. But the atmosphere was heavy. George V sat at the head of the table. He looked around. The trade union was gone. There would be no more letters to Nikki. There would be no more yacht races with Willie. He was the last of the dinosaurs. He looked at his sons. David, the Prince of Wales, was nervously adjusting his tie, already bored, already looking for an exit. Bertie, the Duke of York, sat quietly, struggling with his stammer, terrified of saying the wrong thing. George took a sip of his drink. He had preserved the institution. He had changed the name on the door. But as he looked at the fragile young men who would one day have to carry the burden he had just saved, he must have felt a chill of fear. He had built a fortress, but were the people inside strong enough to hold it? The German king was dead. Long live the House of Windsor. But the shadows in the palace were growing longer. The 1920s roared into London with the sound of saxophones, the clink of cocktail glasses, and the snip of scissors cutting women's hair into bobs. The world had survived the Great War, and now it wanted to forget. It was the era of the flapper, the bright young things, and a desperate, frantic hedonism. In the middle of this neon-lit, fast-paced new world stood King George V, looking like a statue left behind by a previous civilization. He hated the 1920s. He hated the fashion. He hated the music. He hated the painted fingernails. He was a Victorian man stranded in the modern age. While his subjects were dancing the Charleston, George was at Buckingham Palace, checking the barometer, organizing his stamp collection, and ensuring that dinner was served at 8:15 p.m. precisely. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. To the rising generation, he was a relic. They called him a killjoy. But to the majority of the British public, this stubborn refusal to change became his greatest asset. In a world that was spinning too fast, George V was the anchor. He was predictable. He was safe. He was Grandpa England. But behind the closed doors of the palace, The kindly grandfather image evaporated. The man who had saved the monarchy was now waging a war against his own family. He had ruled the empire with duty, but he ruled his children with fear. The tragedy of George V's middle years is that while he was becoming the father of the nation, he was failing spectacularly as a father to his own sons. There is a famous story, likely apocryphal but spiritually true, where George V supposedly said, "My father was frightened of his mother, I was frightened of my father, and I am damned well going to see to it that my children are frightened of me." Whether he said the words or not, he lived them. George V ran his family like a naval ship. He was the captain. His children were the crew. In the Navy, insubordination is punished. In the House of Windsor, individuality was crushed. The atmosphere at Sandringham or Balmoral was suffocating. The king's voice, honed on the quarterdeck of battleships, was booming and harsh. He was obsessed with dress. If one of his sons walked into the room wearing the wrong jacket, or with a tie slightly askew, the king would explode. "Is that what you call dressing like a gentleman?" he would roar. He was incapable of intimacy with his sons. He loved them deep down, but he didn't know how to show it without criticism. He expressed love through discipline. This parenting style had disastrous effects on his children. Prince Henry developed a nervous giggling fit whenever his father looked at him. Prince George rebelled into a life of drugs and bisexuality. But the greatest damage was inflicted on the two oldest sons, David and Bertie. These two men represented two different ways of reacting to trauma. David fought back, Bertie broke down, and the conflict between these three men, the father, the rebel, and the victim, would set the stage for the biggest crisis in royal history. David, the Prince of Wales, was the golden boy of the 1920s. He was handsome, blonde, blue-eyed, and possessed a charisma that his father completely lacked. He was the first global celebrity royal. When he toured the empire, women fainted. The press adored him. George V was jealous, not of the fame, but of the style. He looked at David and saw everything he despised: shallowness, modernity, and a lack of duty. David refused to wear the stuffy uniforms George loved. He wore soft collars. He wore suede shoes. He smoked in public. He danced. He dated married women. The dinner table battles became legendary. George would scream at David for being late. David would sit there, sullen and silent, refusing to engage, which only made the king angrier. George saw David's popularity as a trick. "The boy is mad," he told the prime minister. "He does not know what he is saying." George V had a terrifying premonition about his eldest son. He looked past the charm and saw a fatal flaw in David's character, a complete lack of moral fiber. He saw a man who wanted the privileges of kingship without the burden. In a moment of chilling foresight, George V confided to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. It was a prophecy. David would indeed abdicate in December 1936, less than 11 months after his father's death. George knew his son better than anyone else did. He knew the crash was coming. If David was the target of George's rage, Albert, the Duke of York, was the target of his contempt. Bertie was a shy, nervous child. He had knock knees for which he was forced to wear painful metal splints at night. He was naturally left-handed but was forced to write with his right hand. The result of this relentless pressure was a debilitating stammer. When Bertie couldn't get his words out, George didn't offer patience. He offered volume. "Get it out," he would shout. "Don't just stand there, speak." The more the king shouted, the more the boy stammered. It was a vicious cycle of abuse. Bertie grew up terrified of his father. He developed gastric problems. He shook in the king's presence. George V simply couldn't understand it. He viewed the stammer not as a medical condition or a psychological response to stress, but as a character defect. He thought Bertie just needed to pull himself together. This relationship is vital to understanding the history of the 20th century, because George V's bullying nearly destroyed the man who would have to lead Britain through World War II. It was only through the strength of his wife, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, and later the help of speech therapist Lionel Logue, that Bertie was able to find the voice his father had spent a lifetime silencing. And yet, in a twist of fate, George V began to realize something as he aged. He looked at the dazzling, unstable David, and then he looked at the stuttering, dutiful Bertie, and he realized he had backed the wrong horse. "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children," George told a courtier, "and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." It was a stunning admission. The king was actively hoping for the succession to bypass his heir. He wanted the spare to take over. The only person who could tame the gruff old lion was a toddler. In 1926, Bertie and his wife had a daughter, Princess Elizabeth, known to the family as Lilibet. The transformation in George V was instantaneous and miraculous. The man who had terrified his own children became a doting, gentle grandfather. He was captivated by the little girl. There is a famous story of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, arriving at Sandringham for an audience with the king. He opened the door to the drawing room and stopped dead in his tracks. The King of England, Emperor of India, was on his hands and knees on the carpet. He was pretending to be a horse. Riding on his back, gripping his beard like reins, was the future Queen Elizabeth II. "Giddy up, Grandpa England," she reportedly shouted. The Archbishop quietly closed the door. George adored her. He wrote about her in his diaries with a tenderness absent from his other entries. He recognized in her the very quality his son David lacked: discipline. Even as a child, Elizabeth was serious, orderly, and responsible. George saw a reflection of himself in her. This relationship saved George's public image. In the late 1920s, photos of the king with his granddaughter softened his profile. He wasn't just the severe monarch anymore. He was the nation's grandfather. It humanized him. It gave the British people a sense of continuity, a line stretching from the Victorian past through the turbulent present into the future. While George was dealing with family drama, the political world was shifting under his feet. In 1924, the unthinkable happened. The Labour Party won the election. For a conservative king raised in the Victorian era, the idea of a socialist government was terrifying. Many of the new ministers were men who had been born in poverty. Some were Republicans. Some had been conscientious objectors during the war. The red flag was being sung in Parliament. The upper classes panicked. They expected George V to refuse to appoint Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister. They expected a constitutional crisis, but George V surprised everyone. He remembered the lesson of the Romanovs: if you fight the tide of history, you drown. If you ride it, you survive. He invited MacDonald to Buckingham Palace. He treated him with the exact same courtesy he had shown to aristocratic prime ministers. He wore a red carnation in his buttonhole. He famously told his skeptical courtiers, "They have different ideas to ours, as they are all socialists, but they ought to be given a chance and ought to be treated fairly." It was a masterstroke. By accepting the Labour government, George V proved that the monarchy belonged to all the people, not just the rich. He co-opted the socialists into the establishment. Instead of overthrowing the king, the Labour ministers ended up buying court dress to dine with him. George V had once again saved the firm by adapting. But the stress of constant adaptation was taking its toll. In November 1928, the bill came due. George V fell ill. It started as a cold, but his lungs, blackened by smoke, couldn't fight it off. It developed into septicemia. The infection spread to his blood. His heart began to fail. For weeks, the king hovered at death's door. The nation held its breath. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, standing in the rain, watching the bulletins posted on the gates. It was the first time the public realized how much they actually loved this grumpy, bearded man. He had been there for so long. He was the constant in a changing world. Doctors performed emergency surgery, draining an abscess from his chest right there in the palace. It was messy and dangerous. Miraculously, he survived, but he was never the same. He was sent to Bognor Regis, a quiet seaside town, to recover. He hated it. He was bored. He was in pain. When a courtier later tried to cheer him up by saying that Bognor had been renamed Bognor Regis in his honor, George reportedly growled his famous last verdict on the town: "Bugger Bognor." He returned to London in 1929, but he was a shadow of his former self. He was gaunt. His skin was gray. His voice was raspier. The fire had gone out of him. He was tired. The final act was approaching. The 1930s were dawning, a decade of depression, fascism, and crisis. George V was an old man guarding the throne for a son he didn't trust in a world he no longer understood. He knew his time was running out, and in the back of his mind he worried about the boy. He worried about the empire, and perhaps he worried about how it would all end. He didn't know that his trusted doctor, Lord Dawson, was already keeping a close eye on his failing heart, not just to save him, but to time him. But before that final deadline arrived, the king would experience one last, unexpected blaze of glory in the spring of 1935, the Silver Jubilee of 1935. To everyone's surprise, the celebration of the king's 25 years on the throne was a massive success. The streets of London were packed, the cheers were deafening. "I'd no idea they felt like that about me," George muttered, tears in his eyes. "I am a very ordinary sort of fellow." It was a final wave of affection from the British people, a goodbye. But inside the palace, the mood was grim. George's health was collapsing. He was needing oxygen more frequently. His handwriting was becoming a scrawl. And the political horizon was darkening. Hitler was in power in Germany. The drums of war were beating again. George V, the man who had seen the first Armageddon, looked at the newsreels with dread. "I will not see another war," he told his doctor, "but I fear for those who come after." He was right. He wouldn't see the war, but he wouldn't see the next year either. The calendar turned to January 1936. The king retreated to Sandringham for the winter. He walked in the snow. He shot a few rabbits, but he was cold, so cold. He went to his room. He lay down. The stage was set for the final deadline. By the winter of 1935, the silence at Sandringham House had changed. It was no longer the comfortable silence of a well-ordered royal home. It was the heavy, muffled silence of a waiting room. King George V was dying. He wasn't dying dramatically, like a soldier on the battlefield or a character in an opera. He was dying by inches. He was dying of exhaustion. The Sailor King was simply running out of fuel. He was 70 years old, but he looked 80. His face, once ruddy and fierce, was now gray and shrunken. His famous beard, which Lilibet had once used as reins, was thin. He sat in his chair by the fire, a shawl wrapped around his legs, staring into the flames. Every breath was a labor. His bronchial tubes were constricted. His heart was tired. The outside world was darkening too. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was rearming the Rhineland. In Italy, Mussolini was invading Abyssinia. The League of Nations, the great hope for peace, was crumbling. George V, who had spent his reign trying to steady the ship, could feel the storm rising again. "I am an old man," he told a friend, "and I have been through enough." Christmas 1935 was the final gathering. The family came to Sandringham as they always did. It was a ritual George V had enforced for decades. But this year, the ritual felt like a wake. The tension in the house was palpable. The king's relationship with his eldest son, David, had reached a breaking point. David was now 41 years old, still unmarried, and deeply involved with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. George V refused to receive Mrs. Simpson. He refused to acknowledge her existence. But her ghost sat at the Christmas table with them. David was restless. He hated Sandringham. He hated the cold, the shooting, the boring evenings where his father would listen to the radio or read the Times. He was itching to get back to London, to the nightclubs, to Wallis. George watched him. The king's eyes, though tired, were still sharp. He saw the impatience in his son. He saw the arrogance. He wasn't exciting, but he was theirs. He had been with them through the Boer War, the death of Victoria, the sinking of the Titanic, the Great War, the General Strike, and the Great Depression. He was the father figure of the nation. Every few hours, a footman would walk to the gates of Sandringham and pin a piece of paper to the board. 4 p.m. The king's condition causes anxiety. 6 p.m. The king is growing weaker. Inside the king's bedroom, the atmosphere was hushed. The lights were dimmed. Queen Mary sat by the bedside. She was a woman of immense self-control. She did not wail. She did not panic. She held his hand. She was doing her duty, just as she had done since the day she agreed to marry him to save the dynasty. The king's favorite sister, Princess Victoria, had died just weeks earlier. George had been devastated by her death. Now, in his delirium, he seemingly began to speak to her. Or perhaps he was speaking to the other ghosts, to Eddie, to his father, to Nicky. The room smelled of oxygen and ether. The doctors moved like shadows. Lord Dawson of Penn was in charge. He was checking the king's pulse constantly. He was looking at his watch. It was now evening. The sun had set. The deadline was approaching. At 9:25 p.m., Lord Dawson wrote out the final bulletin for the public. He handed it to the press secretary. It was telephoned to the BBC. At 9:30 p.m., the regular radio broadcast was interrupted. The announcer, John Snagg, spoke in a voice that would become legendary. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close. It is widely considered one of the most beautiful sentences ever written in official history. It was gentle. It was poetic. It suggested a natural, calm, God-given end. It suggested that the king was simply drifting away on a tide of sleep. The nation wept. They imagined their king slipping away peacefully, but the reality in the room was different. The king was lingering. His heart, damaged but stubborn, refused to stop. He was fighting. The sailor king was tough. He was clinging to life with a tenacity that was becoming a problem. Lord Dawson looked at the clock. It was getting late. 10 p.m. If the king lived past midnight, the news would miss the first edition of the Times. It would miss the Morning Post. It would be reported in the afternoon papers, the papers Dawson despised. Dawson looked at the nurse, Catherine Black. He looked at the syringe on the table. The bulletin said the king's life was moving peacefully towards its close. Dawson decided that peacefully wasn't fast enough. The narrative was written. Now, the reality had to be forced to match it. The doctor reached into his medical bag. He wasn't looking for medicine to cure. He was looking for the ingredients of the end. At 10:45 p.m., the king was unconscious, his breathing jagged with the death rattle that distressed the family. As Queen Mary and the Prince of Wales briefly left the room, Lord Dawson seized his moment. He caught the eye of Nurse Catherine Black. The bulletin had promised a peaceful close, but the king's stubborn heart refused to stop. Dawson decided that nature was moving too slowly for the morning edition of the Times. He instructed Nurse Black to prepare a lethal cocktail, 3/4 grain of morphine and 1 grain of cocaine. Nurse Black froze. She knew exactly what this meant. It wasn't pain relief, it was an execution. Yet Dawson was the authority. He believed the cocaine would stimulate the failing circulation just enough to pump the morphine rapidly to the brain, ensuring a swift end. Overruling her conscience, she obeyed. Dawson located the king's distended jugular vein. The needle went in. The plunger was depressed and the chemicals flooded the king's system. Dawson stepped back. He checked his watch. He waited. The effect was not instantaneous, but it was rapid. The king's breathing, which had been labored and noisy, began to shallow. The rattle ceased. The struggle stopped. The king slipped deeper into the final sleep. It is worth pausing to consider the sheer arrogance of this act. In 1936, euthanasia was not a topic of polite conversation. It was a crime. If Dawson had done this to a coal miner or a shopkeeper, he could have been charged with manslaughter or murder. But he did it to the King Emperor, and he did it with the absolute conviction that he was serving the state. He believed the king's death belonged to the public, and therefore, this timing of the death belonged to the public's servants. At 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes before midnight, the king's heart stopped. The timing was impeccable. It was late enough to be the end of the day, but early enough for the editors of the Times to stop the presses, tear up the front page, and insert the prepared obituaries. In the bedroom, the silence was absolute. Lord Dawson leaned over and listened for a heartbeat. There was none. He straightened up and nodded to Queen Mary. "It is over, ma'am." The reaction of the family was stoic. There was no screaming. This was a family that had been trained to suppress emotion since birth. Queen Mary, now the Queen Dowager, did something that signaled the instant shift in power. She stood up. She walked over to her eldest son, David, the playboy, the rebel, the man with the red, puffy eyes, who was now sobbing into a handkerchief. She took his hand. She bowed low and kissed it. "God save the king," she said. It was the moment of transfer. George V was gone. Edward VIII was now the king. David looked at his mother, terrified. He later wrote that he felt cold. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that he was not ready. The shield of his father's authority was gone. He was exposed. The next day, the morning newspapers hit the stands. Just as Dawson had planned, the Times carried the news with black borders and solemn, dignified headlines. The death was reported as a peaceful slipping away. The public read the accounts and felt a sense of closure. They had no idea that the peaceful end had been chemically engineered to meet the printing schedule. For 50 years, the truth of that night remained buried in the archives. Lord Dawson of Penn died in 1945. He was eulogized as a great physician. His reputation was spotless. But Dawson was a meticulous man. He kept notebooks. He wanted credit for what he had done. He didn't see it as a crime. He saw it as his final service to his sovereign. He wrote it all down in his private journal clearly and without euphemism. He wrote, "I therefore decided to determine the end and injected morphia Grange 3/4, and shortly afterwards, cocaine grade 1 into the distended jugular vein." He detailed his reasoning explicitly. The importance of the death receiving its first announcement in the morning papers, rather than the less appropriate evening journals. The notebook sat gathering dust for decades. It wasn't until 1986, when biographer Francis Watson was researching Dawson's life, that the entry was discovered. Watson was stunned. He published the findings in an article for History Today. The revelation hit the British establishment like a bombshell. The headlines were sensational. King George V was murdered. The king who was euthanized. Historians, ethicists, and doctors argued furiously. The defenders argued that Dawson was acting out of mercy. The king was suffering. He was going to die anyway. Dawson simply spared him the final agony. The critics pointed to the newspaper line, "If it was mercy, why care about the printing deadline?" By admitting that the media timing was a factor, Dawson admitted that the king's comfort was secondary to the king's image. It remains one of the most controversial moments in royal medical history. It blurred the line between palliative care and manslaughter. It revealed that the dignity of the monarchy was a stage-managed production, right down to the final breath. While the public mourned George V in January 1936, the family was already watching his prophecy come true. George V had predicted, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." David, now King Edward VIII, began his reign in chaos. He broke protocol. He ignored his advisors. He continued his affair with Wallis Simpson, who was still married to her second husband. George V was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor on January 28, 1936. As the funeral procession moved through London, a strange omen occurred. The Maltese cross on top of the imperial state crown, which was resting on the coffin, fell off. It clattered into the gutter. The new king walking behind the coffin saw it fall. He reportedly muttered, "Christ, what's next?" It was a symbol of the crown falling. Within months, the crisis that George V had feared exploded. The government refused to let Edward marry Wallis Simpson. The church refused. The dominions refused. Edward VIII had to choose the crown or the woman. On December 11, 1936, less than 11 months after his father's death, Edward VIII abdicated. He became the only British monarch to voluntarily give up the throne. George V was right. The boy had ruined himself within 12 months. And then the second part of the prophecy came true. I pray to God that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne. With Edward gone, the crown passed to the stammering, terrified Bertie. He became King George VI, and standing beside him was the little girl with the curly hair, Lilibet, the future Queen Elizabeth II. George V's ghost must have been smiling. His spare had taken the throne. The line was secure. The German adventure was over. The Windsor legacy was safe. George V is often overshadowed by history, but without him, the British monarchy might not exist today. He inherited an institution that was alien and vulnerable. He left one that was British to the core, but the cost was absolute. To keep the ship afloat, he sacrificed his name, his Russian cousins, and his relationship with his sons. In the end, he even sacrificed his final breath. It is a dark, poetic irony that the man who lived by the clock was forced to die by it. He did not die on his own time, he died on the times. As the printing presses roared into life the next morning, the headlines were dignified, and the secret was safe. Lord Dawson slept, satisfied with a job well done. But in the cold dawn, the reign of King Edward VIII began, a reign that would almost destroy everything his father had died to save.